Hello and welcome to the second installment of Road to Republic. I am Miles Eversley.
And I'm Joshua Hinkson. Part 2 of this series brings about a discussion on Barbados' current system of governance, a model of the Westminster system.
Retired Chief Justice Sir David Simmons and Dr. George Bell begin by describing the branches of government and the concepts of separation and fusion of powers.
If you go to a parade, you will see the thing expressed physically in the parade ground, because you would normally see the Prime Minister, the Governor General. You will see not fully, because you will see the military, but they're presented as if they're separate. So it's more or less inducing the view that there's a separation between them.
Well, there are three branches: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. The old theory, first proposed by Montesquieu in the 18th century, is that these three branches should be separate and distinct.
That separation of power goes back to the philosophers who said if you do that, people like Montesquieu and Locke, if you do that separation, you can preserve liberty. So it is less about democracy and more about liberty. You do not want one body, which is the way that you will get what people call sometimes a totalitarian situation. You do not want one person having powers in all the areas. In other words, judge, jury, and everything, you know. So you don't want the Prime Minister telling the police what to do. You don't want the Prime Minister telling the judges what to do. In a sense, you're careful even in how much you intervene with the military. And ultimately, as you want to have with the United States, you don't want the executive being dominated by the legislature or the other way around.
In truth and in fact, contemporary government is so complex that there are areas where there is crossover of function. The legislative branch, let's think of it. The legislative branch consists of those people in the parliament who make the laws, ministers. The executive branch consists of the same people. They're the executive. They're in cabinet, right? So there is that, as I said, almost an amalgam of function between the two branches, the legislative and the executive branches. But I think that it has been accepted now that even though the Constitution is written and formulated on the basis of a separation of powers, that in truth and in fact, there are times when the functions, as I said, particularly between the legislative branch and the executive branch, become blurred, if not fused.
In our small parliaments, when you go into the House of Assembly with a big cabinet, there's really no control over cabinet government, because there's a fusion of the executive and the legislature. And the cabinet can actually have a majority in the legislature, so they can't be voted down. It's the present situation that we have right now because of the 30-love victory. And that is seen as possibly a threat to liberty. In Britain, is a big backbench. You can have a rebellion of the backbench against the cabinet. You can have a government being pulled down by the backbench. So it happened in Barbados, actually, or went near to it, and then eventually Sanford facilitated, because there was a rebellion by some of his cabinet ministers, and then Parliament had sufficient of a majority, not from his party, but with the combination, to win the vote of no confidence. And then he had a choice: hand the executive power over to another member. People were saying Philip Graves, but Sanford still had the power as Prime Minister. So you could say, once he had that power, he could call the election. And that is usually the check that the system has in relation to trivial and frivolous challenges to the executive, because that can happen too, you see. So the The separation also protects the executive from frivolous challenges. Because otherwise you could have, every time that somebody decide, by I would like to be prime minister, you know, and you could get a few people around them, you know, they might be eager enough to move the prime minister. And the prime minister would fall. And that happens a lot in proportional representation systems, you see. But we have a first past the post system, so you don't have that variety of parties within the parliament that you have to do coalitions with, and some of them could come out like what happens in Israel and Italy and so on. So separation is compromised in a way in the Westminster system, and I don't see it as necessarily a worse feature or anything. So it could actually be a positive feature, because what it does to the Westminster system, it gives it a form of stability without the rigidity of the American system. Because the American system, now you have to wait for 4 years. As a matter of fact, again, the same Federalist ideologues, they deliberately give different periods of time to the different parts of their Congress, and to the executive, to the president, and to the judiciary, so that it is very difficult for popular mood to develop within the United States and change the government in the way that it can happen in Westminster. Now in Westminster, what doesn't change is the bureaucracy. So the permanent secretaries and so on, they would hold ground. And then you get a phenomenon like what we've seen in Westminster, you know, where if they get a culture and a consciousness of themselves, they will start to rule the politicians too, because they will say, you're only passing through here, we're here forever, right? But what it does for Westminster is that a person who wins a majority, they can rule in a way that you will find it more difficult to do so in a place where you have proportional representation, not like Guyana, but a proportional representation that you would have in Europe, where the government could fall on the basis of people pulling out from the coalition, and you get instability and difficulty then in rule, even though you might have better representativeness, you know, because small parties can get into parliament then and so on, in a way that they are always pushed out by being a third party, because normally in the kind of system that we have, two parties will dominate, and you actually have a definition of a two-party system on that basis, that is one of two that would most likely win the government, okay? And not the third. The third would normally be, most of the time, would be pushed out. So you don't get the small parties then having to say that they would in a proportional representation system. So that separation of powers, I would say, is mostly designed to preserve liberty and to facilitate liberty. And you can have an extension of that, because if you are in favor of liberty, it's not too far for you to say we should have democracy. But then the two things have to come together and try to balance themselves out. And the systems are not perfect, you know, and from my philosophical background, I would know that they're imperfect. But I would say that the Westminster system has qualities that can give you comfort. So it can also preserve things that you want changed. And therefore, a lot of people can stay in there and, in a sense, timidly suffer. Because you can't get the things changed. Right? It takes real long to change. I've given you all the example of more kind of iconic radical things where it takes 50 years to get down Nelson, you see? But there are many other things that can be done.
Dr. Bell describes the formal structure of Parliament, with there being two houses and the head of state, as stated in the Constitution.
The first base should be to go to the Constitution and let the Constitution tell you what Parliament is. And it would say that Parliament, the composition of Parliament, there shall be a Parliament of Barbados, which shall consist of, again another point for republicanism, shall consist of Her Majesty, a Senate, and a House of Assembly. Okay? They know two words, no two ways about it. It says it explicitly. There shall be a Parliament of Barbados, which shall consist of Her Majesty, a Senate, and a House of Assembly. And then it tells you how many senators there would be and how they would be selected. And then it goes on to the House of Assembly and tells you how that is selected. And it already has said that the Parliament is made up of Her Majesty, a Senate, and a House of Assembly. The executive is the Prime Minister in Cabinet, and that executive sits in the legislature. Either the majority of the members have to be in the lower house, and some of the ministers have to be in the lower house that are critical ministers, or in the Senate, which is still a part of the legislature. You have to become a minister in the Westminster model. You have to be a member of the legislature. You have to be a member of Parliament. And on that basis, Barbados is governed through the Prime Minister in Cabinet. But as we said before, the executive power is defined in the Constitution as resting in Her Majesty. And this is the big hurdle that we have to face in coming to a conscious position to change Barbados from a monarchy to a republic.
Dr. Bell continues by explaining the role of the Cabinet and the Prime Minister.
The safest place with all these important features of the form of government that we practice is to go to our Constitution. On the question of the Prime Minister in Cabinet, it says that there shall be a Cabinet for Barbados, which shall consist of the Prime Minister and not less than 5 other ministers appointed in accordance with the provisions of the relevant section, and that the Cabinet shall be the principal instrument of policy and shall be charged with the general direction and control of the government of Barbados and shall be collectively responsible, therefore, to Parliament. That is the critical part there. The Cabinet shall be the principal instrument of policy and shall be charged with the general direction and control of the government of Barbados and shall be collectively responsible to Parliament. So that tells you exactly what happens in the Westminster system in relation to the Prime Minister and Cabinet, that he's first among equals, and that the Cabinet of Barbados is the government of Barbados. That form of government has evolved over centuries in the British context, and then it was passed on to us through our colonial relationship with the British, and then it matured into the independence period, which this Constitution is reflecting, and that is how the Prime Minister has that relationship in what we call the Westminster Whitehall system, and therefore is the head of the government of Barbados, not the head of state, as the Governor General is the head of state, but he's head of government, and the effective executive. Now, it's one thing to describe that in that way, but initially the Prime Minister was the person who could mobilize support for policy within the British House of Commons on the basis of his capacity to intervene and engage in debates on policy. And you had caucuses that would develop within the Assembly that would give majorities to whoever. That would have consolidated more in the 19th century with the dominance of the Whigs and the Tories. The Whigs are what today we would call the Liberal Party, which is now more or less a third party in Britain, but not with much chance of being able to win government. So the dominant parties emerged, that's the Labour Party, emerged towards the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, and it became the second party to the Tories, the Conservatives. But evolving with that was this feature of the Prime Minister in Cabinet. And then in the 20th century, what emerged further was what is called prime ministerial government, where the Prime Minister started to dominate the Cabinet. So it goes like this. You have a legislature in which you engage to try to win the majority support within the lower house of the legislature. Then a personality leads that. And then that consolidates with the rise of party politics to the party dominating in the legislature because of, quote unquote, the whip, and the person who leads the party. And then in the basis of the evolution of the executive, the cabinet, the domination of the cabinet within the party and then within the legislature. But we can say this if we qualify it in relation to the smaller territories like in the Caribbean, that the cabinet is not able to dominate in Britain in the way in which a cabinet can dominate, let's say in Barbados, because of the size of the British Parliament. So backbenchers in Britain have a much more formidable presence than backbenchers in Barbados. Right now we got 2 or 3 backbenchers in our Parliament. Okay? And the cabinet is the rest of the Parliament. In the British system, the cabinet is never going to be the majority of the Parliament, even within its own party. So you can always have a rebellion by the backbenchers and a containment. And the political leaders has been taking that in terms of judgment, political judgment. What can they get away with? How far can they push this thing and so on? We don't have to do that in a lot of the smaller territories of the Commonwealth. And that is consistent too with what has emerged in Britain, despite what he just said, that the Prime Minister most often in the Westminster system gets his way. More so than the President of the United States gets his way in the United States system. So that's why we often used to have as a discussion point at university level, who is more powerful, the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of Britain? And the conclusion really is that the Prime Minister of Britain is more powerful. Okay? Although most people might not think so because of the formal powers of the American president and so on. Then get the thing through Congress. Because he doesn't sit in Congress or anything like that. The Prime Minister sits in legislature and can face off with the people. And then if he has a strong majority, he can actually dominate that majority, dominate that legislature through that majority in his party. And if he has a strong cabinet, the cabinet can dominate the party. And if he is a strong Prime Minister, he can dominate the cabinet. And then you get the emergence of what is called Prime Ministerial government, which is a big reality within the Westminster system in its contemporary condition. So we could say very much in Barbados that we have prime ministerial government. And we had it under Barra, we had it on Tom Adams. Once the prime ministerial position had consolidated and you had strong politicians in the leadership, they dominated the cabinet, dominated the legislature, dominated their party in the legislature, and then on the basis of a majority in the legislature, dominated the legislature. And that is why you had this view that the Prime Minister was now dominant. So the issue of the function of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, we laid it out from the Constitution, but it gives real executive power in the Westminster system to the legislature, to a person in the legislature, that's the Prime Minister and Cabinet in the legislature. Whereas in systems that have stronger separation of powers, the executive stands outside of the legislature. And that is a constitutional requirement of the United States government, that the executive is not a part of the legislature, that it stands outside the legislature. So you don't find the president electing, having members of his cabinet in the legislature, other than the vice president who chairs the Senate.
The role of the cabinet is provided for in the Constitution. It says that the cabinet is the principal instrument for making policy. But of course, it can have other functions depending on if legislation specifically gives cabinet specific functions. So that, for example, with the Don Blackman, C.O. Williams case involving Highway 2A, Cabinet's role in that was not policy making. Cabinet had to deal with the award of the contract. In that respect, Cabinet was exercising a statutory power under the Financial and Administration Audit Act and the rules made thereunder. And any public body exercising a statutory power is reviewable. Or put it the other way, the exercise of power, statutory power, by a public body is judicially reviewable. On Wednesdays, you usually get the papers circulated by the Cabinet Secretary. The various ministers are bringing papers on various things. Now, those papers may be guided by manifesto commitments. In the 2018 election, there was a lot of talk about the lack of buses and the difficulties that the public were having in getting home. And so many buses were not bought in the previous 8 years or whatever. You heard it on the platforms. And then in the manifesto of the Barbados Labour Party, they committed themselves to improving the transport board and buying an adequate number of buses and making sure that the people who use buses have buses available to them. Huh? There would have been a point of time when the transport board would have examined all of the requirements for increasing the fleet of buses. And they put up a paper to the minister that says, you know, we need so many buses. Now these buses cost X dollars, so we can only manage so many in a year. But all that analysis, financial analysis, goes to the minister. And in the ministry then, the officials in the ministry take that paper and refine it. And it goes from the minister then sends it to cabinet. So that paper will come as whatever from MTW, number 1 of 2018, or not wouldn't be number 1 because it was May. Anyhow, it will have a number for 2018. And all of the members of cabinet would see that paper, and the way cabinet papers are written is very easy to follow. They begin with a statement of the issue. The matter for the consideration of the cabinet is the purchase of 20 new buses from the Republic of China. And then the argument follows. And at the end of that paper, cabinet is invited to ABC agree, let us say, that the transport board entered into negotiations to purchase 20 buses. And then anything that is consequential on that agreement will go to paragraph A, B, C, and so it's simple. So you start with what is the issue, then you go through the argument and discussion, and you end with an invitation to cabinet to agree 1, 2, 3. So that when the minutes are written for the next meeting, it's easy. Cabinet agreed, and you pull out what was there in the previous thing, 1, 2, 3. That's the minute. Not Miles said this and David Simmons said that, and the next minister said something, and then you go on and on pages. You record decisions.
However, there is an argument which says that within our governance system, the power which a prime minister wields can in fact be reflective of an autocratic leader.
There is that narrative that the prime minister is in fact an elected dictator. Okay? And I've heard on calling program a couple of times using this illustration again from Trinidad, where he says this conference is going on, and somebody from the floor told Eric Williams, you know what we should have in Trinidad is a prime ministerial dictatorship. And Williams answered, and what do you think you have? Yeah. So I think the fellow would say it's a benign dictatorship or something like that. And Williams told him, so what do you think you have? If you follow the logic of what I said before, we could understand how that would happen. If you have a very dominant prime minister in a cabinet, remember that the prime minister is first among equals. He can fire and hire the cabinet minister. There's no challenge to that. That is the power of the prime minister. So if there's a prime minister that's going to tell you, like it is alleged Eric Williams did say to, all of you ministers must give me an unsigned letter of resignation, and I will fill in the date. Well, you don't have to ask if he's a dictator. Okay? And if you don't agree with him, well, in a sense, theoretically though, if you are a minister in a cabinet and you don't agree with the prime minister, you're supposed to resign. Because the way that the prime minister, from what I am told, is allowed to make decisions, and I've seen it, for instance, at the university level in council with the chancellor. And the chancellor normally don't have a lot of power, the vice chancellor, okay? But the chancellor at council meetings has power because he is in charge of the council. And one of the ways in which he expresses that power is to say what is the opinion of council. And they don't put it to the vote. I heard a chancellor say, it is the opinion of council. And he can ask for the vote. And the prime minister can also say, it is the opinion of this cabinet. And if you don't like it, resign. Because I am the prime minister, okay? I heard how recently somebody said of Earl Barra in St. Philip in relation to, I think it was St. Philip South at the time, that he wanted a particular candidate as the member of parliament to run for St. Philip South. Barra went up there and said, this is the person I want to run up here. And if you all don't want him, find a new leader. But they had the choice. What new leader were they going to find? So they had to bow. And if a prime minister can do that in cabinet, and then the cabinet can do that in the party, and the party has the majority in the parliament, that is the basis for saying that there's a prime ministerial dictatorship. That's how you get to that conclusion. Yeah. And I'm saying that the advantage of it, if there's an advantage, is that it gives the majority some certainty in getting their will through parliament. Because the prime minister, on the other hand, as the leader of a party that won an election, is supposed to be the champion of the masses. So when you start to undermine that, who is the champion of the masses? You ain't got no champion of the masses. You ain't got nobody that can ensure the will of the people through parliament on the basis of dominance. And then you get a weak prime minister. And then when you get a weak prime minister, what do you get? You get a whole lot of influences coming in then to say who should do what where, and these people ain't elected. So the question is, have you changed something that was better for something that is worse? So that is why it is not so straightforward when people jump up and say, the prime minister got too much power, let's reduce the prime minister. What you might do is you might give too much power to somebody else who don't even come to you to face you in elections. So that is what you have to address and discuss and analyze in relation to whether you can come to an easy conclusion that the prime minister is a dictator and the prime minister has too much power. When you have a no-confidence motion and is against the prime minister and the prime minister loses, he's supposed to, in 3 days, resign or ask for the dissolution, advise the Governor General to dissolve Parliament and have new elections. Now, what would have happened in '94 is that there would have been a quick debate on, if not publicly, as to what should you do with Sandiford now, because Sandiford has lost the vote in Parliament. Now, theoretically, that means that every time he goes in there, the same set of people that voted against him could vote again, and therefore he can't govern. So the logical, theoretical conclusion is that he should resign. Now, he is prime minister, though, so he has the power to call election. So he could resign or call election, because you could say, if you don't want me, let the people decide, not you. Not the 30 people that are here will decide. The people, they're going to decide, so I can call the election. Apparently, that was before Sandiford, because people that were in Parliament at the time indicate to you that what the Democratic Labour Party wanted in terms of the people that were moving against Sandiford was that Philip Graves would become Prime Minister. And that what would happen is that Sandiford would hand over to Philip Graves. But they wanted to do that without Sandiford picking it up. And Sandiford picked it up immediately because somebody went and said, we have our man. He said, well, yeah, you got your man. I can show you what man you got. And he called the election, you see? And then he had time to play with then in terms of when the election would actually be held. That shows a fusion of the executive and the legislature. That is what that is, because the prime minister is sitting in Parliament, in the legislature. He can be brought down by the legislature. So that is where the Westminster model has fusion of power. You can't do that in the United States other than by impeachment, okay? And So the man is there for 4 years. Then you can impeach him, but it takes a long time. And even then, when you impeach him, you got to impeach him in the lower house, in the House of Representatives, and then you got to try him in the Senate and find him guilty. And as we have seen, Trump was impeached twice by the House of Representatives, and then both times he wasn't found guilty by the Senate. So it's not easy then to remove him from office, because it's only when he is found guilty in the upper chamber that he can be removed from office. In the Westminster system, if you have the situation where Sanford cannot govern anymore, then he is confronted with the reality. All he can do is to change the majority in this parliament by going to the election. But he could also lose the election.
One of the main points of contention in the transition process is the removal of the Queen as head of state and, by extension, the Governor-General as her representative. Dr. Bell goes on to discuss these state figures.
The Governor-General, as you know, is just the representative of the Queen, of the monarch, we should say, in our parliament, because we have a parliamentary government, and the head of the parliamentary government is the Queen. The Constitution actually says the executive authority of Barbados is vested in Her Majesty. So it is not, and that is another reason for talking about the change from a republic. The Constitution itself tells you that there is no question mark about who is the head of state of Barbados, and the executive authority. But even though that is up in the air, you know that the real executive is the Prime Minister, and it goes on to outline that too. Okay, but it says that the executive authority of Barbados is vested in Her Majesty. Subject to the provisions of the Constitution, the executive authority of Barbados may be exercised on behalf of Her Majesty by the Governor-General, either directly or through officers subordinate to him. Okay, so that is the relationship there. Now, that is to some extent going back to preserving prerogative, the royal prerogative and so on, right, which is a part of the whole evolution of the British system and the relationship between monarch and parliament. But the British over time have worked out this compromise between the British monarchy and the House of Commons, essentially. And the British monarch remains as head of the parliament. Now, if you look at the state opening of the parliament, there's a strange little occurrence that happens in England, you know. Presently is a queen. When the queen goes to parliament, she travels in a state coach. And then there's another state coach. And traveling in that state coach is the crown by itself, with a sword and a number of other paraphernalia. And that is carried in as if it is a person into Parliament. And then it's put on the Queen's head. Okay? And that you hear this reference to the crown. Even in the same Trinidadian Constitution that I was talking about, they make the statement, wherever in the previous Constitution it said crown, we shall now read state. Okay? So it replaces the crown with the state. And there is no doubt at all in our Constitution that this British monarch is the executive authority of Barbados. And that is what, in the 21st century, should be a bit of a problem for Barbadians. That we could still be operating at a level where the Constitution itself says the executive authority of Barbados is vested in Her Majesty. Surely we should be able to get over that hurdle. And that is one of the strongest arguments, I would say, for making that initial move, simply to remove the monarchy and establish Barbados as the state. And that is why some of the politicians, if you look at the debates, they say they have problems when they're swearing into the British monarchy in relation to allegiance, why they don't swear to the Barbadian people, and so on. So when you go to the Constitution and you find these aspects of it, you can build up, in a sense, the case for Republican status. And it means just going through it and seeing where too great a concession is made to the old colonial executive.
We've heard about the Parliament and the Cabinet, head of government and head of state. So you may query the composition of the lower house of assembly. Dr. Bell begins his answer by describing the electoral system employed in Barbados as compared to a number of our regional neighbors.
We have chosen an electoral system in which the person that gets the majority takes all. And he's the person, that's the person elected. That distinguishes you from a proportional representation system that you would have in a republic like Guyana, which is also a part of the Commonwealth, but it is a republic, and it is a republic with a difference. It is not a parliamentary republic like Dominica or Trinidad. The Guyana has an executive president, and they have lists, and you vote for the list. And I think theoretically they will say that the people at the top of the list going first, and the person at the top of your list should be the person who's going to be president. Okay, and that is how they determine the leader of their government. In the Westminster system, if you have a general election in Barbados, you in fact have 30 elections, and the people in each election they vote for candidates who are seeking the seat to represent the particular constituency. The person who gets the majority of votes in that constituency, not necessarily, they call it a plurality. The person who gets the majority vote is going to go into Parliament. Even if you had two people come in behind him who have more votes than he has together, that's not going to get them into Parliament. The third person most definitely will be running out all the time. And the second person is most likely to take the first person, but the first person is the person that got that majority of votes, and they're going. And that is how the majority is constituted within the House of Assembly itself, the elected house. The Constitution says that the Governor General, who is acting on behalf of the Queen, so in Britain it would be the Queen, then looks at the composition of this assembly and makes a determination that of who is the person in that assembly that is commanding the majority of the votes. And that's a very practical conclusion, because if you make a wrong judgment on that and you go into Parliament, the person can be voted down in the first session and be voted down eternally in that session until they call another election. So you're wasting time. So your judgment better be good in relation to who you choose. We know that in Trinidad, under the Republic, but it's a parliamentary republic, that A.N.R. Robinson was faced with that problem when the PNM tied with Pandey's party. And Pandey was the sitting prime minister. And A.N.R. Robinson is the president, a former PNM man, but he was no longer a PNM man, but a former PNM man. He chose Patrick Manning. And there was a lot of noise about it. I think that was one of the things that put off Barbados from following the Trinidad model back in 2000. But I think it was a bad example. I don't think that should have put us off in any way, because that is unusual and peculiar in that sense in relation to the specific situation. It can happen in the Westminster system that because the Governor General, on behalf of the Queen, has that prerogative to make that determination, but it is a determination that should be made with common sense, in order that you do not put somebody there who will not be able to sustain themselves in office. So really and truly, the basis for the government to be formed is the Governor General saying, I can identify who will be commanding the majority in this Parliament, in the House of Assembly. And that person is invited to form a government. Now, there are some people that say that it is also the person that gets the government house and tells the Governor General, I am the person that can command the majority. It is alleged that when Errol Barra died, that Cameron Tudor told Erskine Sandiford, Mr. Sandiford, we cannot afford to indirect them. Let us go to Government House and get a Prime Minister. And it was only then that Erskine Sandiford recognized that he it was possible that he could become prime minister. And he went to Government House and presented himself as the person that could command the majority. There were some people in the Democratic Party that felt that Richie Haynes could have gone to Government House and told the Governor General that he could command the majority and that he might have been chosen as prime minister. But that is not what happened. So Erskine Sandiford became prime minister, and that was, you know, full of problems from there on, because there was a tension between him and Richie Haynes in relation to who should be the prime minister. But the point that we're making is that the Governor General chooses that person who, in their judgment, should be able to command the majority and sustain it in the House. And then that person is sworn in as prime minister. And once they're sworn in as prime minister, they pick their ministers. And that's why every time a prime minister is changed, the ministers also go. Because it is the prime minister that has to pick the ministers. The Governor General picks the prime minister, but on a realpolitik basis. And then the prime minister picks the ministers, and he can hire and he can fire. And that is how a government is formed, and that is how it will fall as well. So that is the way in which the government is formed. It is formed by the person who can command the majority in the House. Now, likewise, the leader of the opposition is formed by the person who commands the majority of the persons who do not support the government. And the language, again, will be such that, as we saw when this guy challenged whether Adderley should be leader of the opposition, it has no basis in law, because the question of a group can be singular or plural in the law. So Adderley is the person who commands the group that is the biggest group in the House of Assembly that does not support the present government, and therefore he's leader of the opposition. Okay? And that's how the government is formed. If you go beyond that in relation to the government, well, of course, you have the cabinet ministers that are chosen from, as we said before, from the Senate, and who can go into cabinet. But there are some cabinet members, think like the Attorney General, who has to come from the lower house. The Minister of Finance would have to come from the lower house. And you can choose other ministers. Right now we have the Minister of Tourism in the Senate. We have the Minister of Foreign Affairs in the Senate, and so on. And that is the government. But the government is also the civil service. So if you go beyond that, then you have your permanent secretaries and all the apparatus there that transcends, or let's say persists, has continuity beyond the electoral process. So the guy is a permanent secretary. He can be shifted around, but he's going to survive the rise and fall of the government in relation to the legislature.
The discussion surrounding the transition to Republican status has also brought the role and composition of the Senate under scrutiny.
Now, when I looked at the discussions, debates enhanced on these commissions and the question of whether we should change the Republican status and so on, I noticed that a lot of arguments revolved around the question of the Senate. And a lot of it in the composition of the Senate. So I think important people in Parliament had a problem with the Senate. The Senate came from the old Legislative Council in the colonial system. And the Legislative Council was, as I said, in the old representative system, was made up of prominent senior large planters and so on, plus the colonial office officials, etc. And that was replaced then by the Senate, but it is really linking back to the House of Lords. That in Britain, the House of Lords is made up of people who were created as lords, in other words, a reward system for their political services. And also, more fundamentally, it is made up of people who are hereditary lords, who are aristocrats. a number of British governments, especially the one under Blair, I think, were concerned with reducing the powers and the numbers of the hereditary lords in Britain, and therefore reducing the House of Lords. But we inherited that as a part of bringing the Westminster Whitehall system to the West Indies. And since we accepted that we were going to use Westminster. The argument, you see, is that you needed a house that would bring about the space for reflection. That also you might need a house that on the basis of its wisdom would bring amendments to what might be legislation that was not drafted in the most refined way. And that second chamber allows for that capacity. So one of the justifications for our upper chamber is to say that it would bring refinement to what is thrown out from the lower house because they have time to reflect on it. And that it can also bring refinement because the people in that house are of greater wisdom. Now, that second one ain't necessarily true, or so, but it is that it could be so. In the old Legislative Council, they would have argued that it was so, that the bigger planters would be wiser, and they would be able, and the officials of the colonial officials would be wiser. And then, so what the people at the other level said that they could reflect on and bring greater wisdom. In the United States Senate, beside the federal position, also has that in it, because even the age at which you can go in the Senate is slightly more than anybody that's just going in the House, you see, the House of Representatives. And that's supposed to say that the person will have more experience, and they would be wiser, and they would be more enlightened, and they would reflect. They also stay in office for longer, so that a member of the Senate serves for 6 years, but 1/3 of them change every 2 years. The House of Representatives, they have to face election every 2 years. So the people in the House of Representatives are almost in constant election mode to try to get back into the House of Representatives. The fellows in the Senate can sit back. They're also representing a broader range of people. So whereas a person in a small constituency could have what, if you were to go to the extreme of Rottenborough, that is everybody down there, the same kind of people, and they vote for one kind of person. That is very much less likely to happen in a state where you can have a variety of types of people, and therefore your politics has to be more well-crafted in order to be able to get a majority support in such a situation. So that itself is a compelling reason why your politics might be wiser than from somebody coming from a very narrow electoral base. Those are some of the things that would justify an upper chamber. But some of them, as we can see, are not really quite true, especially with our Senate, because in many ways, the people that are in the Senate, a good few of them are not senior people at all. And I don't know if you could describe them as wise, politically wise. They might be people that are given a political chance, might be being prepared for the future. There are some of them that would have experience. There are some of them that are old politicians. There are some of them that are failed politicians all the same as well, and so on and so forth. So but the argument behind it is that nonetheless it is a house that gives time for reflection on the legislation that's coming through from the lower house. They can sit back and look at it and give an opinion that might bring refinement, which is to the advantage of the electorate and the population. And therefore, that is a justification for its presence and its role. So we have continued to hold that Senate. Now the question was, who do you put in the Senate then?
The Senate, which replaced the Legislative Council, again, has that theoretical role of tempering decisions that might come through Parliament. And you might say that anything that comes through a Parliament with a majority of 29-1 is a very strong recommendation. Now, the Senate is established by our Constitution with 21 people. The one provides for the President, who would not normally vote except to have to cast a vote if there's a split. But when you think about the constitution of the parliament, the Senate is constituted with 11 members plus the president, 12 members nominated by the prime minister of that government when the new government comes into being. The opposition leader nominates 2 members. So you have 11 plus 1, which is 12, against 2. And then there are 7 independent members. Now those independent members are nominated by the Governor General. And in speaking to older members of the Senate and 1 or 2 in the House, they don't recall the independent members being anything but independent. Certainly, when I was appointed, and I was told I was appointed because independent members are supposed to bring a level of knowledge and expertise and experience into the Senate which is not present among the nominated members by government or the opposition. So when I was nominated, I was told, well, you have 2 big roles. You're expected to be both a historian and a physician, and to bring medical and historical and preservation experience and expertise into the Senate, because there was no one doing that among the other nominated people. Well, I sat next, initially, I sat next to Orlando Marvell, who is a retired teacher, lecturer, and diplomat. And there was a businessman among the independent senators, there was a lawyer among the independent senators, there was the dean, the retired dean, Sir Roy Trotman, and so on. With my visions and my thoughts and my ideas, in the first year of a new government, I'd be putting ideas to them for the improvement of our health services. And then when nothing happens, in the second year, I start being looked at askance. By the third year, the new government usually labels me as opposition. And then the next government, the government changes and we do the same thing. And when things don't happen, and we who have ideas don't get noticed, then we appear to become critics of the present government. And I think that during my period of 6 years in the Senate, we were all truly independent. And what I discussed when I made the film with Dame Billy Miller and Sir Frederick Smith and so on, was the fact that even if the Parliament passed something which said something completely radical or destructive or super conservative, something that completely taxed the poor in favor of the rich, you know, that if Parliament did something like that, and the entire independent senators of all 7, plus the 2 opposition, all agreed that this was not right, well, the government had 12 people to vote against 9 people. So the constitutional establishment of the nature of the Senate and its composition means that in theory, nothing could ever be sent back.
Yeah, I mean, I respected the Senate, of course I had to do, but the Senate is really, was for me, still is, a rubber stamping institution. It would be a very rare occasion when something would have to go back, either for the lawyers in the relevant chambers to correct or amend, or, because there may be an amendment, that sort of thing. You know, and there's some people who would say, well, it gives the younger people a chance to get a feel. That wasn't the case. It was older people in the Senate.
And what I'm told by the clerk and deputy clerk of Parliament is that in their time working with Parliament, they could not recall a single instance, neither in my 6 years nor in their previous couple of decades, where anything was actually sent back, because the independent senators and the opposition could not outvote the government. So nothing was ever put to the vote.
I don't think that there's any proper capture of the people representing these independent interests in that sense by the people that are selected by the Governor General. And it's difficult to do it anyhow. And in the discussion, the critical discussion that has developed around the senators that are called independent senators, the defining position apparently is not so much that they're independent or that they're representing any special interest, is that the Governor General selected them. Okay? So it is that the government didn't select them and the opposition party didn't select them, and therefore they're independent. I mean, you know, that's a constitutional fiction in relation to whether they're actually independent political forces. And many of them you can identify what party they represent and so on. But they defend themselves by saying that they didn't go in there on the basis of being independent of party, that they went in there on the basis of being selected by the Governor General. And in some cases, there are enough of them to frustrate the government at the level of the higher house. And that has happened. In our case, for instance, in recent times, where when you needed a 2/3 majority or whatever, you couldn't get it because the independent senators could resist it, and there are sufficient of them to frustrate those numbers. But that is the history behind the Senate, and I think is one of the areas that eventually, as I said, I think that we should pursue the question of what would you do with the Senate down the road? What would you do with the judiciary? What would you do with this and what you would do with that, as is delineated in the constitutions? But that you do it when you have time. If you try to say you will do all that right now, you can have the call for a referendum, and then the referendum is likely to frustrate any movement from where we are now. And I have already mentioned to you all that it could take 50 years to move. It took 50 years to move Nelson, and so on. And there will be other instances in which we could refer to things that would take 50 years to be done, or more. And the Bible says that years of a man are 70 years and 10. So that would tell you that you will have a lifetime and you won't get certain things changed. And some people feel that that should be so. You know. On the other hand, I saw an interesting comment by Harold Bernard St. John on the Senate. So Harold Bernard St. John. And he said that one of the reasons the Senate is there is in case we went again to a federal government. And what you would do is that the Senate would perform the role of a proportional representation in capturing the federal representatives. And I had never heard that really before. And it's, of course, it's a kind of far out kind of position, because if you had a federal parliament, it probably would supersede any local assemblies anyhow. But he did use that argument that he was in favor of retaining the Senate, and he gave the traditional arguments, but then he said the really important one was to do with the fact that it would facilitate capturing a federal representation, and it would do it at a level of proportional representation. It would preserve the federation then, like the way that the Senate in the United States preserves the federal relations as distinct from the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives captures constituencies across the United States, but the Senate, 2 for each state, even if you got California and then some little baby state somewhere else, 2 senators. And that's because that's to capture the union, to say that the members of the union are equal. And so that is the argument that he carried.
Well, there you have it, a discussion on our current system of governance, to be continued in our next episode. Josh, that brings us to the end. Until next time, I am Miles Eversley.
And I'm Joshua Hinkson. Thanks for joining us.